Hey y'all, so today I want to build off a previous video where we made this modal, and this modal is fine and all, but like I said, I wanted to make this modal reusable so that you can use it across many different parts of your app and not have to repeat the code over and over again. And so to do that, we're going to make use of Vue Slots. So this will also kind of cover Vue Slots if you're not familiar with that, but basically, yeah, we're going to take this modal and make it into an even better component. So if you haven't watched the original video, definitely watch that first to get caught up, because we'll be building off that code. So let's first talk about Vue Slots. If you're not familiar with this, I'm going to do a quick overview. So Vue Slots is basically, it's a Vue element that you can add to a component. And like you see here in this child component, in any custom component, you can define this element slot. And what it does is it allows for whenever you use the component, such as here in the parent component on the left side, when we're using this component, we can add code inside of the child element, and it will this code will be transferred over to wherever the slot is, right? So it will be placed instead of the slot. If, for example, you want to have a component, but you don't know exactly what content you're going to put inside, and you want to let whoever's using this component to decide what content to put inside, you can use a slot to add like a dynamic, essentially it's like a dynamic slot. And just like the name indicates, with a slot, you like insert code externally into this component. And so this instance here, this is called the default slot because it's just one slot and it's just whatever is directly inside the element, it will get placed into this default slot. We also have these things called named slots, and it would just be like slot name equals say title. And what that does is having named slots allows you to make many different slots for different parts of this component. And then on the left side, when you're using the component, you can like define different types of content to fit into the different named slots. So that gives you a lot of flexibility. And so if the diagram was still a little bit confusing, I think it might help to look at this example. And so this is just the code of the page I just showed you all a little earlier, right? So on this left side, we have this testing page. It literally just has some text with a button to open this modal. And this modal is just using, there's nothing fancy to it. It just opens and closes the modal, right? And on the right side, this was the code for our modal that we defined in the previous video. And so you can see that all this content, for example, this body content, this text, these buttons, this title, it's all hard-coded, right? But for a modal, like we said, there's a lot of different scenarios where you might use it, and the content is definitely not going to be the same every time, right? So we need to use slots here to make that part dynamic. So let's start with the header, right? And this was probably going to be the most apparent example. So I want to define a slot here, and what I'm going to do is get rid of this text, right? And I'm going to give this slot a name, right? Like I said, if you don't give it a name, it's just called, the name is default, like literally the string default. It's called the default slot. But if you give it a name, then this is, its name. And if we look at our modal, we'll see that there's no header, right? Because we don't have any content there. It's just a slot. So to give it some content, we would need to go on the left side here. What we would do is we would define this element called a template element. So the template and the slot element kind of go hand in hand. And what we would do is we would say vSlot and give it the name of the slot we want to put it in, right? So you could say default, and that would be the default slot, because remember I said it's literally named default, but here let's put something in the title slot, right? So essentially what we're saying here is any code that I put here, for example this is a modal title, any code I put here will get essentially inserted where this slot is, right? And it could be multiple lines too. And all of this code is going to get put right here when this component is rendered. And so if we open up our modal again, we'll see that, this is the text that we just wrote on the left side that's getting inserted into the component, the modal component via slots. That's just the very basic example of that. Now let's focus on making the rest of the modal dynamic using the slots, and then we'll come back to the left side to put the content inside. So this body part is also going to need to be dynamic. So we're going to put a slot here, and let's name this body. Then down here at the buttons, this part is the trickier part, right? So with the buttons, what we want to do is we have this emit cancel and emit confirm. And that just means whenever these buttons are clicked, we will emit this custom event. And that way the parent element can listen for these events, like at cancel, at confirm. And these are really important, right? We want to emit these events even if they replace the button. Like if they want to customize the button, that's fine, right? But we still want to emit this event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it with a button, and I'm going to put the click handler up here. And then I'm going to define the slot here. And I'm going to make this name cancel button. Okay, so this is a little bit different, right? I have a slot, but I have some content inside the slot. What does that mean? Well, that just means that this is going to be the default content. I shouldn't say default, fallback. The official term is called fallback content. Like in case the user doesn't define a template vslot cancel button, this content inside here is going to get rendered instead as a fallback, right? If nothing's defined, we'll render this as a fallback. And so that's great because most of the time, a cancel button, many times you won't want to customize it, right? So it is what it is, and you just leave it. Then it saves a lot of time for the user to use it. So I'm going to do something similar here for the confirm button. And then I'm going to put this slot here. I'm going to name this confirm button and move this over down here. I want to I'll move this margin up here too. And so just to reiterate, the reason why we're moving this click handler up here is so in case the user defines a custom button, like say they add the slot template vslot confirm button, they want a button instead of confirm, they want the text to be say delete. Well, just because they added that, we still want to emit this confirm event, right? Just because they changed the button, and they can style the button however they want to, but that way they don't have to worry about, are we going to emit this event or not? We're just going to handle it for them. Okay? And same thing with the margin. Then they don't have to worry about the spacing of the buttons. They can just customize the button itself, and it'll just be in the right position by default. So one last thing we can do here is actually add a slot up here called footer, and we can put all of this under here. And so it might be kind of weird, right? Because we have a slot here and then a slot nested under it. So how does nested slots work? Well, for nested slots, basically what it means is the user has two options. If the user decides to add a template content for footer, it's going to replace all of this stuff. None of this stuff is going to get rendered. It's basically ignored, right? And then whatever content they define for footer is going to be placed to replace this entire chunk of code. And what that's useful for is, for example, if the user doesn't want to have any buttons at all, they don't even want a footer, they can just define an empty template for footer, and it will essentially it won't render any of this code. But if they want most of the normal footer, and say they just want to customize one or two buttons, then they can just use these slots. Since they didn't define a slot for footer, they didn't define a template for footer, this default fallback content will get rendered, and then they can use these slots as normal. Okay, so save this, and let's look at what the modal looks like right now. Since, remember, we added the slot for the body, but we didn't add any fallback content. That's why the body is blank. There's no template content defined by the parent, as well as no fallback content defined in the slot. So therefore, it's blank. The header, this part, remember, is from the template content we defined. And then these buttons, remember, are default, right? And so you see the buttons, they work still as normal. It's still emitting the event. Okay, so now let's fill in the content. Okay, so first let's delete this and just make it modal title example. And so now we want to define some content for the body. Okay, cool. And so now going back to this footer part. Let's say, for example, I wanted to clear out the entire footer. I didn't want anything in the footer to show up. I can define this template and then just make this like an empty. This is just the break line, right? So it's basically white space. There's nothing that's going to show up here. And since this vslot footer we defined for footer, this code is going to replace this entire slot, right? That means all of that is going to be gone and it won't show up. And if we look, that's exactly what happened, right? We don't have a footer. We just have this title and body. And they can still close it using this X, but we don't have a footer. So you can see like this might be sometimes useful. Maybe we don't want the button sometimes. But let's take this back, and we'll see that the default content should show back up now. Okay, so we have our default buttons now. Great. Okay, so now that we've seen the basics of the slots, let's look at a slightly more practical example. And let's say we have, this is like a, I don't know, like a to-do list. I kind of just drafted this up really quickly, okay? So don't worry about it too much. Well, let's just say we have this list of items, right? And we can click this trash can and it'll just delete stuff, okay? And let's say since once we delete it, we can't reverse it, right? So we want to maybe give them a modal to confirm if the user intends to delete this item so they don't accidentally press it, right? And so, by the way, here's the code for it. You can see it's super simple. There's just a container with a bunch of items inside of it. Here's the array for these items. They're just strings. And we iterate for each item. We give it like, it's just a flex box with, you know, a checkbox, the item name, and this trash can button. And when you click it, it'll delete the item. And what it does is it feeds the index. So this is a thing in Vue. You can, it's kind of like in Python where you can enumerate the item and the index simultaneously. So it's a item, comma, I, this is the index for all items. So this will be the actual data, the string, and this will be like 0, 1, 2, 3 based on the index, right? Okay, so we pass this index and we splice. Basically, it deletes item at this index, and we just delete one item. And yeah, so that's what it does. And now we want to, instead of to directly delete the item, we want to confirm delete. What that'll look like is we probably want to add a modal first, and we need to import it too. Let's make the variable to toggle this modal. So in the other example, we just had a pretty generic variable name, but in an actual application, you want the variable name that's controlling the modal to be relevant to the modal, right? What the modal actually does. You don't just want to say modal visible, because if you have multiple modals, you don't know which one is controlling which modal, right? So we're going to pass this into this modal. Delete item modal visible, right? So that's very specific. It tells us exactly which modal we're trying to control for. And we're going to listen to two events, at cancel and at confirm. And so on cancel, we can just set the Boolean to false to close the modal. Let's close this to give us some more space. So on cancel, we just close the modal. Here, we want to, let's add a function called confirm delete item. And we'll take in an item index here too. And what we want to do here is open the modal to prompt them to confirm. And then once the modal confirms, we'll delete the item. So first things first, we need to set the modal to visible, right? And the thing is, since we're sharing one modal between all the different items, we also need to keep track of which item we're trying to delete. And so I'm going to add a variable called item to delete. Set it to null at first. And then we'll set item to delete equals to the item index. Okay, actually let's just set it to 0 initially. So we'll say item to delete is equal to the item index. Then when we confirm, we'll just call delete item with the item to delete. So we'll pass this into here and it'll splice the array as usual. And the last thing we need to do is, so when we click the button, instead of directly deleting the item, we'll first confirm. Oh, and sorry, I forgot. In here, we also would want to set the modal to false, visible to false, right? Because we want to close the modal once it has been deleted. Okay, so now that's most of the logic that we need. Now we just want to customize this modal a little bit, right? So if we remember, we have several different parts that we need to fill in. First one is the title. And let's just give it a text of, like, say, confirm delete. And then for the body, let's just say, are you sure you want to delete this item? This cannot be undone. Give them a warning. And let's also customize the confirm button. So by default, the confirm button was this, this primary color button that says confirm. But let's give it a danger style. So in general, like a lot of frameworks, they have this different styles of buttons, like primary, secondary, danger, warning. Danger usually just means it's like red. And we'll give it the text of delete. So save this and let's look at the site, and we'll see that it has our text here, has our title, the button is now red, and when we click delete, it will delete the item. And cancel does nothing. Okay, cool. So that's really it for this video. Like you've seen, using this slots combined with the templates allows you to create one general purpose component such as modal, and now I can import this component into so many different places within my app and just fill in these small little template fields and have such a robust functional modal to work with just very quickly. This will help you make overall some of your components more reusable, and also if you're using a framework like Bootstrap Vue or Material Design Vue, their components will make use of slots too, so now you'll better understand how to utilize those components as well. So hopefully y'all learned something from this video. If you enjoy this type of content, please be sure to like and subscribe to support my channel and stay up to date on any future content that might come out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.